Chapter 57 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by antonygirgis. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 57. News from home not very agreeable, although the reader may laugh. We arrive at Portsmouth, where I fall in with my old acquaintance Mrs. Trotter. We sail with a convoy for the Baltic. I had written to my sister Ellen, giving her an account of all that had passed, and mentioning the character of the captain and his apparent intimacy with my uncle. I received an answer from her telling me that she had discovered from a very communicative old maiden lady that Captain Hawkins was an illegitimate son of my uncle, by a lady with whom he had been acquainted about the time that he was in the army. I immediately conceived the truth that my uncle had pointed out to him as an object of his vengeance, and that Captain Hawkins was too dutiful and too dependent a son not to obey him. The state of my father was more distressing than ever, but there was something very ludicrous in his fancies. He had fancied himself a jackass, and had brayed for a week, kicking the old nurse in the stomach, so as to double her up like a hedgehog. He had taken it into his head that he was a pump, and with one arm held out as a spout, he had obliged the poor old nurse to work the other up and down for hours together. In fact, there was a string of strange conceptions of this kind that had accumulated, so as to drive my poor sister almost mad, and sometimes his ideas would be attended with a very heavy expense, and he would send for architects, make contracts, etc., for building, supposing himself to have come to the title and property of his brother. This being the basis of his disease occurred frequently. I wrote to poor Ellen, giving her my best advice, and by this time the brig was again ready for sea, and we expected to sail immediately. I did not forget to write to O'Brien, but the distance between us was so great, that I knew I could not obtain his answer probably for a year, and I felt a melancholy foreboding how much I required his advice. Our orders were to proceed to Portsmouth, and join a convoy collected there, bound up the Baltic, under the charge of the Acasta frigate, and 2 other vessels. We did not sail with any pleasure or hopes of gaining much in the way of prize money. Our captain was enough to make any ship a hell, and our ship's company were composed of a mutinous and incorrigible set of scoundrels with, of course, a few exceptions. How different did the officers find the brig after losing such a captain as O'Brien and so fine a ship's company! But there was no help for it, and all we could do was to make the best of it and hope for better times. The cat was at work nearly every day, and I must acknowledge that generally speaking it was deserved, although sometimes a report from the sergeant of marines of any good man favoured by me was certain to be attended to. This system of receiving reports directly from an inferior officer instead of through me as first lieutenant became so annoying that I resolved at all risks to expostulate. I soon had an opportunity, for one morning the captain said to me, "Mr. Simple, I understand that you had a fire in the gallery last night after hours." "It's very true, sir, that I did order a stove to be lighted, but may I inquire whether the first lieutenant has not a discretionary power at that point? And further, how is it that I am reported to you by other people? The discipline of this ship is carried on by me under your directions, and all reports ought to come through me, and I cannot understand upon what grounds you permit them through any other channel." "I command my own ship, sir, and shall do as I please in that respect. When I have officers I can confide in, I shall, in all probability, allow them to report to me." "If there is anything in my conduct which has proved to you that I am incapable or not trustworthy, I would feel obliged to you, sir, if you would, in the first place, point it out, and in the next, bring me to a court-martial if I do not direct it." "I am no court-martial man, sir," replied he, "but I am not to be dictated to by an inferior officer, so you'll oblige me by holding your tongue. The sergeant of marines, as master-at-arms, is bound to report to me any deviation from the regulations I have laid down for the discipline of the ship." "Granted, sir, but that report, according to the custom of the service, should come through the first lieutenant." "I prefer it coming direct, sir. It stands less chance of being garbled." "Thank you, Captain Hawkins, for the compliment." The captain walked away without further reply, and shortly after went down below. Swinburne ranged up alongside of me as soon as the captain disappeared. "Well, Mr. Simple, so I hear we are bound to the Baltic. Why couldn't they have ordered us to pick off the convoy off Yarmouth, instead of coming all the way to Portsmouth? We shall be in tomorrow with this slant of wind." "I suppose the convoy are not yet collected, Swinburne, and you recollect there's no want of French privateers in the Channel." "Very true, sir." "When were you up in the Baltic, Swinburne?" "I was in the old St. George, a regular old 98. She sailed just like a haystack, 1 mile ahead and 3 to leeward. Lord bless you, Mr. Simple, the Cattegat wasn't wide enough for her, but she was a comfortable sort of vessel after all, expecting on a lee shore, so we used always to give the land a wide berth, I recollect. By the by, Mr. Simple, do you recollect how angry you were because I did peach at Barbados when the man sucked the monkey? To be sure I do. Well then, I didn't think it fair then, as I was one of them, but now that I'm a bit of an officer, I'll just tell you when we get to Calcelona. There's a method of sucking the monkey there, which, as first lieutenant with such a queer sort of captain, it is just as well as you should be up to. In the old St. George we had 70 men drunk one afternoon, and the first lieutenant couldn't find out nohow. Indeed, Swinburne, you must let me into that secret. So I will, Mr. Simple. Don't you know there's a famous stuff for cuts and wounds called balsam? What, Riga balsam? Yes, that's it. Well, all the boats will bring that for sale, and they did to us in the old St. George. Devilish good stuff it is for wounds, I believe, but it's not bad to drink, and it's very strong. We used to take it inwardly, Mr. Simple, and the first lieutenant never guessed it. What, you all got tipsy upon Riga balsam? All that I could, so as to give you a hint. I'm much obliged to you, Swinburne. I certainly never should have suspected it. I believe seamen would get drunk upon anything. The next morning we anchored at Spithead and found the convoy ready for sea. The captain went on shore to report himself to the admiral, and as usual the brig was surrounded with bumboats and wherries, with people who wished to come aboard. And we were not known on the Portsmouth station, and had no acquaintance with the people. All the bumboats were very anxious to supply the ship, and as this is the option of the first lieutenant, he is very much persecuted until he has made his decision. Certificates of good conduct from the other officers were handed up the side from all of them, and I looked over the books of the capstan. In the second book the name struck me. It was that of Mrs. Trotter, and I walked to the gangway out of curiosity to ascertain whether it was the same personage who, when I was a youngster, had taken care of my shirts. As I looked at the boats, a voice cried out, "Oh, Mr. Simple, have you forgot your old friend? Don't you recollect Mrs. Trotter?" I certainly did not recollect her. She had grown very fat, and although more advanced in years, was a better looking woman than when I had first seen her, for she looked healthy and fresh. "Indeed, I hardly did recollect you, Mrs. Trotter." "I have had so much to tell you, Mr. Simple," replied she, ordering the boat to pull alongside, and as she was coming up, desired the man to get the things in, as if permission was quite unnecessary. I did not counter-order it, as I knew none of the others, and as far as honesty was concerned, believed them all to be much on par. On the strength, then, of old acquaintance, Mrs. Trotter was admitted. "Well, I'm sure, Mr. Simple," cried Mrs. Trotter out of breath with climbing up the brig's side, "what a man you've grown, and such a handsome man, too! Dear, dear, it makes me feel quite old to look at you when I call to mind the little boy I had charge of in the cockpit. Don't you think I look very old and ugly, Mr. Simple?" continued she, smiling and smirking. "Indeed, Mrs. Trotter, I think you wear very well. Pray, how is your husband?" "Ah, Mr. Simple, poor dear Mr. Trotter, he's gone. Poor fellow. No, what with his drinking, and his love for me, and his jealousy. Do you recollect how jealous he was, Mr. Simple? He wore himself out at last. No wonder, considering that he had been accustomed to, after keeping his carriage and dogs with everybody, to be reduced to see his wife go a-bumming. It broke his heart, poor fellow, and Mr. Simple, I've been much happier ever since, for I could not bear to see him fretting. Lord, how jealous he was, and all about nothing. Don't you want some fresh meat for the gun-room? I've a nice leg of mutton in the boat, and some milk for tea." "Recollect, Mrs. Trotter, I shall not overlook you bringing spirits on board." "Lord, Mr. Simple, how could you think of such a thing? It's very true that these very common people do it, but the company I have felt, the society I have been in, Mr. Simple. Besides, you must recollect that I never drank anything but water." I could not exactly coincide with her, but I did not contradict her. "Would you like the Portsmouth paper, Mr. Simple?" taking one out of her pocket. "I know gentlemen are very fond of the news. Poor Trotter used to never stir from the breakfast table until he had finished the daily paper, but that was when we lived in a very different style. Have you any clothes to wash, Mr. Simple, or have any of the gentlemen?" "I fear we have no time, for we shall sail soon," replied I. "We go with the convoy." "Indeed!" cried Mrs. Trotter, who walked to the main hatchway and called to her man Bill. I heard her give him directions to sell nothing upon trust in consequence of the intelligence of our immediate sailing. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Simple, I was only desiring my head man to be sent for your steward, that he might be supplied with the best, and to save some milk for the gun-room. And I must beg your pardon, Mrs. Trotter, for I must attend to my duty. Mrs. Trotter made her curtsy and walked down the main ladder to attend to her duty, and we separated. I was informed she had a great deal of custom, as she understood how to manage the officers, and made herself generally useful to them. She had been a bumboat woman for 6 years, and she had made a great deal of money. Indeed, it was reported that if a first lieutenant wanted 40 or 50 pounds, Mrs. Trotter would always lend it to him, without requiring his promissory note. The captain came on board in the evening, having dined with the admiral, and left directions for having all ready for unmooring and heaving short at daylight. The signal was made from the frigate at sunrise, and before 12 o'clock we were all under way, and running past St. Helena with a favourable wind. Our force consisted of the Acasta frigate, the Isis ship, sloop, mounting 20 guns, the Reindeer, 18, and our own brig. The convoy amounted to nearly 200. Although the wind was fair and the water smooth, we were more than a week before we had made an Holt light, owing to the bad sailing and inattention of many of the vessels belonging to the convoy. We were constantly employed, repeating signals, firing guns, and often sent to tow up the sternmost vessels. At last we passed the Holt light with a light breeze, and the next morning the mainland was to be distinguished on both bows. End of chapter 57.
Chapter 58 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 58. How we passed the Sound and what passed in the Sound. The captain overhears again a conversation between Swinburne and me. I was on the signal chest abaft, counting the convoy, when Swinburne came up to me. "Have you been here before with a convoy, Swinburne?" "To be sure I have. And it's sharp work that I've seen here, Mr. Simple. Work that I've an idea a captain won't have much stomach for." "Swinburne, I beg you will keep your thoughts relative to the captain to yourself. Recollect the last time. It is my duty not to listen to them." "And I should rather think to report them also, Mr. Simple," said Captain Hawkins, who had crept up to us and overheard our conversation. "In this instance, there is no occasion for my reporting them, sir," replied I, "for you have heard what has passed." "I have, sir," replied he, "and I shall not forget the conversation." I turned forward. Swinburne had made his retreat the moment that he heard the voice of the captain. "How many sails are there in sight, sir?" inquired the captain. 163, sir," I replied. "Signal to convoy to close from Acasta," reported the midshipman of the watch. We repeated it, and the captain descended to his cabin. We were then running about 4 miles an hour, the water very smooth, and Anholt lighthouse hardly visible on deck, bearing north-northwest about 20 miles. In fact, we were near the entrance of the Sound, which the reader may be aware is a narrow passage leading into the Baltic Sea. My watch was nearly out, when the midshipman, who was looking round with his glass on the Copenhagen side, reported 3 gunboats sweeping out from behind a point. I examined them and went down to report them to the captain. When I came on deck, more were reported, until we counted 10, 2 of them large vessels called prams. The captain now came on deck, and I reported them. We made the signal of enemy in sight to the Acasta, which was answered. They divided, 6 of them pulling along shore towards the convoy in the rear, and 4 coming out right for the brig. The Acasta now made the signal for boats manned and armed to be held in readiness. We hoisted out our pinnace, and lowered down our cutters, the other men of war doing the same. In about a quarter of an hour the gunboats opened their fire with their long 32-pounders, and their first shot went right through the hull of the brig, just aft the forebitts. Fortunately, no one was hurt. I turned round to look at the captain. He was as white as a sheet. He caught my eye and turned aft, when he was met by Swinburne's eye steadily fixed upon him. He then walked to the other side of the deck. Another shot ploughed up the water close to us, rose and came through the hammock netting, tearing out 2 of the hammocks and throwing them on the quarter-deck. When the Acasta hoisted out pennants and made the signal to send our pinnace and cutter to the assistance of vessels astern, the signal was also made to the Isis and Reindeer. I reported the signal and inquired who was to take the command. You, Mr. Semple, will take the pinnace and order Mr. Swinburne into the cutter. Mr. Swinburne, sir, replied I. The brig will in all probability be in action soon, and his services as a gunner will be required. Well, then, Mr. Hilton may go. Beat to quarters. Where is Mr. Webster? The second lieutenant was close to us, and he was ordered to take the duty during my absence. I jumped into the pinnace and shoved off. 10 other boats from the Acasta and the other men of war were pulling in the same direction, and I joined them. The gunboats had now opened fire upon the convoy astern, and were sweeping out to capture them, dividing themselves into 2 parties and pulling towards different portions of the convoy. In half an hour we were within gunshot of the nearest, which directed its fire at us, but the lieutenant of the Acasta, who commanded the detachment, ordered us to lie on our oars for a minute, while he divided his force in 3 divisions of 4 boats each, with instructions that we should each oppose a division of 2 gunboats. This was well arranged. I had the command of 1 division, for the first lieutenants had not been sent away from the Isis and Reindeer, and having inquired which of the divisions of gunboats I was to oppose, I pulled for them. In the meantime we observed that the 2 prams and 2 gunboats, which had remained behind us and had been firing at the Racehorse, had also divided, 1 pram attacking the Acasta, the 2 gunboats playing upon the Isis, and the other pram engaging the Rattlesnake and Reindeer, the latter vessel being in a line with us and about a half a mile farther out, so that she could not return any effectual fire, or indeed receive much damage. 1 of the prams mounted 10 guns and the other 8. The last was opposed to the Rattlesnake, and the fire was kept up very smartly, particularly by the Acasta and the enemy. In about a quarter of an hour I arrived with my division close to the vessel which was the nearest to the enemy. It was a large Sutherland-built ship. The gunboats, which were within a quarter of a mile of her, sweeping to her as fast as they could, as soon as they perceived our approach, directed their fire upon us, but without success, except the last discharge, in which, we being near enough, they had loaded with grape. The shot fell a little short, but 1 piece of grape struck 1 of the bowmen of the pinnace, taking off 3 fingers of his right hand as he was pulling his oar. Before they could fire again, we were sheltered by the vessel, pulling close to her side, hid from the enemy. This continued for some time, the enemy not advancing nearer, but firing into the Sutherland ship, which protected us. At last the master of the ship looked over the side and said to me, "I say, my joker, do you call this giving me assistance? I think I was better off before you came. Then I had only my share of the enemy's fire, but now that you have come, I have it all. I'm riddled like a sieve, and have lost 4 men already. Suppose you give me a spell now, pull behind the vessel ahead of us. I'll take my chance." I pulled up to the other vessel, a large brig, and the captain, as soon as we came alongside, said, "I see what you're about, and I'll just leave you my vessel to take care of. No use losing my men, and being knocked on the head. All's right, you can't do better, and we can't do better either." His boat was lowered down, and getting in with his men, he pulled to another vessel and lay behind it, all ready to pull back if a breeze sprang up. As was to be expected, the gunboats shifted their fire to the deserted vessel, which the boats lay behind, and thus did the action of our quarter continue until it was dark, the gunboats not choosing to advance, and was restricted from pulling out to attack them. But I soon perceived that the gunboats were nearing us every time that they fired, and I now discharged grape alone, waiting for the flash of the fire to ascertain their direction. At last I could perceive their long, low hulls, not 2 cables' lengths from us, and their sweeps lifting from the water. It was plain that they were advancing to board, and I resolved to anticipate them if possible. I had fired ahead of the brig, and I now pulled with all my boats astern, giving my orders to the officers, and laying on our oars in readiness. The gunboats were about half a cable's length from each other, pulling up abreast, and passing us at about the same distance, when I directed the men to give way. I had determined to throw all my force upon the nearest boat, and in half a minute our bows were forced between their sweeps, which we caught hold of to force our way alongside. The resistance of the Danes was very determined. 3 times did I obtain a footing on the deck, and 3 times I was thrown back into the boats. At last we had fairly obtained our ground, and were driving them gradually forward, when, as I ran onto the gunwale to obtain a position more in advance of my men, I received a blow with the butt end of a musket, I believe on the shoulder, which knocked me overboard, and I fell between the sweeps and sank under the vessel's bottom. I rose under the stern, but I was so shook with the violence of the blow that I was for some time confused. Still I had strength to keep myself above water, and paddled, as it appeared, away from the vessel, until I hit against a sweep which had fallen overboard. This supported me, and I gradually recovered myself. A light breeze rippled the water, and I knew that I had no time to lose. In about 5 minutes I heard the sound of oars, and perceived a boat crossing me. I hailed as loud as I could. They heard me, laid on their oars, and I hailed again. They pulled to me, and took me in. It was the master of the brig, who, aware of the capture of one gunboat and the retreat of the other, was looking for his vessel, or, as he told me, for what was left of her. In a short time we found her, and although very much cut up, she had received no shot under water. Here I may as well relate the events of the action. One of the other divisions of gunboats had retreated when attacked by the boats. The other had beaten off the boats and killed many of the men, but had suffered so much themselves as to retreat without making any capture. The Acasta lost 4 men killed and 7 wounded. The Isis 3 men wounded. The Reindeer had nobody hurt. The Rattlesnake had 6 men killed and 2 wounded, including the captain. But of that I shall speak hereafter. I found that I was by no means seriously hurt by the blow I had received. My shoulder was stiff for a week and very much discoloured, but nothing more. When I fell overboard, I had struck against a sweep which had cut my ear half off. The captain of the brig gave me dry clothes, and in a few hours I was very comfortably asleep, hoping to join my ship the next day. But in this I was disappointed. The breeze was favourable and fresh, but we were clear of the Sound, but a long way astern of the convoy, none of the headmost men of war to be seen. I dressed and went on deck, and immediately perceived that I had little chance of joining my ship until we arrived at Karlskrona, which proved to be the case. About 10 o'clock the wind died away, and we had from that time such baffling light winds that it was 6 days before we dropped our anchor, every vessel of the convoy having arrived before us. End of chapter 58. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 59 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 59. The dead man attends at the auction of his own effects, and bids the sale to stop. One more than was wanted. Peter steps into his own shoes again. Captain Hawkins takes a friendly interest in Peter's papers. Riga Balsam sternly refused to be admitted for the relief of the ship's company. As soon as the sails were furled, I thanked the master of the vessel for his kindness, and requested the boat. He ordered it to be manned, saying, "How glad your captain will be to see you." I doubted that. We shook hands, and I pulled to the Rattlesnake. which lay about 2 cables' length astern of us. I had put on a jacket when I left the brig on service, and coming in a merchantman's boat, no attention was paid to me. Indeed, owing to circumstances, no one was on the lookout, and I ascended the side unperceived. The men and officers were on the quarter-deck attending the sale of dead men's effects before the mast, and every eye was fixed upon 6 pairs of nankin trousers exposed by the purser's steward, which I recognized as my own. 9 shillings for 6 pairs of nankin trousers, cried the purser's steward. Come on, men, they're worth more than that, observed the captain, who appeared to be very facetious. It's better to be in his trousers than in his shoes. This brutal remark created a silence for a moment. Well then, steward, let them go. One would think that pulling on his trousers would make you as afraid as he was, continued the captain, laughing. Shame was cried out by 1 or 2 of the officers, and I recognized Swinburne's voice as one. More likely, if they put on yours, cried I, in a loud, indignant tone. Everybody started and turned around. Captain Hawkins staggered to a carronade. I beg to report myself as having rejoined my ship, sir, continued I. Hurrah, my lads! 3 cheers for Mr. Simple, said Swinburne. The men gave them with emphasis. The captain looked at me, and without saying a word, hastily retreated to his cabin. I perceived as he went down that he had his arm in a sling. I thanked the men for their kind feeling towards me, shook hands with Thompson and Webster, who warmly congratulated me, and then with old Swinburne, who nearly wrung my arm off, and gave my shoulder such pain as to make me cry out, and with the others who extended theirs, I desired the sale of my effects to be stopped. Fortunately for me, it had just begun, and the articles were all returned. Thompson had informed the captain that he knew my father's address and would take charge of my clothes and send them home, but the captain would not allow him. In a few minutes I received a letter from the captain, desiring me to acquaint him in writing, for the information of the senior officer, in what manner I had escaped. I went down below, when I found one very melancholy face, that of the past midshipman of the Acasta, who had received an acting order in my place. When I went to my desk, I found 2 important articles missing. One, my private letter book, and the other, the journal, which I kept of what passed, and from which this narrative has been compiled. I inquired of my messmates, who stated that the desk had not been looked into by any one but the captain, who of course must have possessed himself of those important documents. I wrote a letter containing a short narrative of what had happened, and at the same time another on service to the captain, requesting that he would deliver up my property, the private journal and letter book in his possession. The captain, as soon as he received my letters, sent up word for his boat to be manned. As soon as it was manned, I reported it, and then begged to know whether he intended to comply with my request. He answered that he should not, and then went on deck, and quitted the brig to pull on board of the senior officer. I therefore determined immediately to write to the captain of the Acasta, acquainting him with the conduct of Captain Hawkins, and requesting his interference. This I did immediately, and the boat that had brought me on board not having left the brig, I sent the letter by it, requesting them to put it into the hands of one of the officers. The letter was received previous to Captain Hawkins' visit being over, and the captain of the Acasta put it into his hands, inquiring if the statement were correct. Captain Hawkins replied that it was true, that he had detained these papers, as there was so much mutiny and disaffection in them, that he should not return them to me. That I cannot permit, replied the captain of the Acasta, who was aware of the character of Captain Hawkins. If, by mistake, you have been put in possession of any of Mr. Simple's secrets, you are bound in honour not to make use of them, neither can you retain property not your own. But Captain Hawkins was determined, and refused to give them to me. "Well, then, Captain Hawkins," replied the captain of the Acasta, "you will oblige me by remaining on my quarter-deck till I come out of the cabin." The captain of the Acasta then wrote an order directing Captain Hawkins immediately to deliver up to him the papers of mine in his possession, and coming out of the cabin, put it into Captain Hawkins' hands, saying, "Now, sir, here is a written order from your superior officer. Disobey it if you dare. If you do, I will put you under an arrest and try you by a court-martial." Captain Hawkins bit his lip at the order. "Your boat is manned, sir," said the captain of the Acasta in a severe tone. Captain Hawkins came on board, sealed up the books, and sent them to the captain of the Acasta, who redirected them to me on His Majesty's service, and returned them by the same boat. The public may therefore thank the captain of the Acasta for the memoirs which they are now reading. From my messmates I gained the following intelligence of what had passed after I quitted the brig. The fire of the Pram had cut them up severely, and Captain Hawkins had been struck in the arm with a piece of the hammock rail, which had been shot away shortly after I left. Although the skin only was razed, he thought proper to consider himself badly wounded, and giving up the command to Mr. Webster, the second lieutenant, had retreated below, where he remained until the action was over. When Mr. Webster reported the return of the boats, with the capture of the gunboat and my supposed death, he was delighted that he quite forgot his wound, and ran on deck rubbing his hands as he walked up and down. At last he recollected himself, went down into his cabin, and came up again with his arm in a sling. During the short time that we remained in port, I took care that Riga Balsam should not be allowed to come alongside, and the men were all sober. We received orders from the captain of the Acasta to join the admiral, who was off the Texel, in pursuance of directions he had received from the Admiralty to dispatch one of the squadron, and we were selected from the dislike which he had taken to Captain Hawkins. End of chapter 59. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 60 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 60. An old friend in a new case. Heart of oak in Swedish fir. A man's a man all the world over, and something more in many parts of it. Peter gets reprimanded for being dilatory, but proves a title to a defense allowed. When we were about 40 miles off the harbor, a frigate hove in sight. We made the private signal. She hoisted Swedish colors and kept away a couple of points to close with us. We were within 2 miles of her when she up courses and took in her t-gallant sails. As we closed to within 2 cable lengths, she hove to. We did the same, and the captain desired to lower down the boat and board her, ask her name, by whom she was commanded, and offer any assistance if the captain required it. This was the usual custom of the service, and I went on board in obedience to my orders. When I arrived on the quarter-deck, I asked in French whether there were any one who spoke it. The first lieutenant came forward and took off his hat. I stated that I was requested to ask the name of the vessel and the commanding officer, to insert it in our log, and to offer any services that we could command. He replied that the captain was on deck, and turned around, but the captain had gone down below. I will inform him of your message. I had no idea that he had quitted the deck, and the first lieutenant left me. I exchanged a few compliments and a little news with the officers on deck, who appeared to be very gentlemanlike fellows, when the first lieutenant requested my presence in the cabin. I descended. The door was opened. I was announced by the first lieutenant, and he quitted the cabin. I looked at the captain, who was sitting at the table. He was a fine stout man, with 2 or 3 ribbons at his buttonhole, and a large pair of mustachios. I thought that I had seen him before, but I could not recollect when. His face was certainly familiar to me, but as I had been informed by the officers on deck that the captain was a Count Shuckson, a person I had never heard of, I thought that I must be mistaken. I therefore addressed him in French, paying him a little compliment with all the necessary etceteras. The captain turned round to me, took his hand away from his forehead, which it had shaded, and looked me full in the face, replied, "Mr. Semple, I don't understand but very little French. Spin your yarn in plain English." I started. "I thought that I knew your face," replied I. "Am I mistaken? No, it must be Mr. Chuck's." "You are right, my dear Mr. Semple. It is your old friend Chucks, the boatswain, whom you now see." We shook hands heartily, and then he requested me to sit down. "But," said I, "they told me on deck that the frigate was commanded by Count Shuckson." "That is my present rank, my dear Peter. But as you have no time to lose, I will explain all. I know I can trust to your honour. You remember that you left me, as you and I supposed, dying in the privateer, with the captain's jacket and epaulettes on my shoulders. When the boats came out, and you left the vessel, they boarded and found me. I was still breathing, and judging of the rank by my coat, they put me into the boat and pushed on shore. The privateer sank very shortly after. I was not expected to live, but in a few days a change took place, and I was better. They asked me my name, and I gave my own, which they lengthened to Shuckson. Somehow or another I recovered by a miracle, and am now as well as ever I was in my life. They were not a little proud of having captured a captain of the British service, as they supposed, for they never questioned me as to my real rank. After some weeks I was sent home to Denmark in a running vessel, but it so happened that we met with a gale and were wrecked on the Swedish coast, close to Karlskrona. The Danes were at that time at war, having joined the Russians, and they were made prisoners, while I was of course liberated and treated with great distinction. But as I could not speak either French or their own language, I could not get on very well. However, I had a handsome allowance and permission to go to England as soon as I pleased. The Swedes were then at war with the Russians, and were fitting out their fleet. But God bless them, they didn't know much about it. At last they all came to me, and if they did not understand me entirely, I showed them how to do it with my own hands, and the fleet began to make a show of their rigging. The admiral who commanded was very much obliged, and I seemed to come as regularly to my work as if I were paid for it. At last the admiral came with an English interpreter, and asked me whether I was anxious to go back to England, or would I like to join their service. I saw what they wanted, and I replied that I would prefer an English frigate to a Swedish one, and that I would not consent unless they offered something more, and then with the express stipulation that I should not take arms against my own country. They then waited for a week, when they offered to make me a count, and give me the command of the frigate. This suited me, as you may suppose, Peter. It was the darling wish of my heart. I was to be made a gentleman. I consented, and was made Count Shuckson, and had a fine large frigate under my command. I then set to work with a will, superintended the fitting out of the whole fleet, and showed them what an Englishman could do. We sailed, and you of course know the brush we had with the Russians, which I must say did us no discredit. I was fortunate to distinguish myself, for I exchanged several broadsides with a Russian 2-decked ship, and came off with honour. When we went into port, I got this riband. I was out afterwards and fell in with a Russian frigate and captured her, for which I received this other ribbon. Since that I have been in high favour, and now that I speak the languages, I like the people very much. I am often at court when I'm in harbor, and Peter, I am married. I wish you joy, Count, with all my heart. Yes, and well married, too, to a Swedish countess of very high family, and I expect that I have a little boy or girl by this time. So you observe, Peter, that I am at last a gentleman, and what is more, my children will be noble by 2 descents. Who would have thought that this would have been occasioned by my throwing the captain's jacket into the boat instead of my own? And now, my dear Mr. Simple, that I have made you my confidant, I need not say, do not say a word about it to anybody. My dear Count, replied I, your secret is safe with me, and my pleasure is very great. I then, in a few words, stated where O'Brien was, and then we parted. I went with him on deck, Count Shuckson taking my arm and introducing me as an old shipmate to his officers. I hope we may meet again, said I, but I'm afraid there is little chance. Who knows, replied he. See what chance is done for me? My dear Peter, God bless you. You are one of the very few whom I always loved. God bless you, my boy, and never forget that all I have is at your command if you come my way. I thanked him, and saluting the officers, went down the side. As I expected, when I came on board, the captain demanded in an angry tone why I had stayed so long. I replied that I was shown down into Count Shuckson's cabin, and he conversed so long that I could not get away sooner, as it would not have been polite to have left him before he had finished his questions. I then gave a very civil message, and the captain said no more. The very name of a great man always silenced him. End of chapter 60. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 61 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 61. Bad news from home and worse on board. Notwithstanding his previous trials, Peter forced to prepare for another. Mrs. Trotter again improves as she grows old. Captain Hawkins and his 12 charges. No other event of consequence occurred until we joined the Admiral, who only detained us 3 hours with the fleet, and then sent us home with his dispatches. We arrived after a quiet passage at Portsmouth, where I wrote immediately to my sister Ellen, requesting to know the state of my father's health. I waited impatiently for an answer, and by return of post received one with a black seal. My father had died the day before from a brain fever, and Ellen conjured me to obtain leave of absence, to come to her in her state of distress. The captain came on board the next morning, and I had a letter ready written on service to the Admiral, stating the circumstances and requesting leave of absence. I presented it to him and entreated him to forward it. At any other time I would not have condescended, but the thoughts of my poor sister, unprotected and alone, and my father lying dead in the house, made me humble and submissive. Captain Hawkins read the letter and very coolly replied that it was very easy to say that my father was dead, but he required proofs. Even this insult did not affect me. I put my sister's letter in his hand. He read it, and as he returned it to me, he smiled maliciously. "It is impossible for me to forward your letter, Mr. Simple, as I have one to deliver to you." He put a large folio packet into my hand and went below. I opened it. It was a copy of a letter demanding a court-martial upon me, with a long list of the charges preferred by him. I was stupefied not so much at his asking for a court-martial, but at the conviction of the impossibility of my now being able to go to the assistance of my poor sister. I went down into the gun-room and threw myself on a chair, at the same time tossing the letter to Thompson, the master. He read it over carefully and folded it up. "Upon my word, Simple, I do not see that you have much to fear. These charges are very frivolous." The next morning, the official letter from the port admiral came off, acquainting me that a court-martial had been ordered upon me, and that it would take place that day week. I immediately resigned the command to the second lieutenant, and commenced an examination into the charges preferred. They were very numerous, and dated back almost to the very day that he had joined the ship. There were 12 in all. I shall not trouble the reader with the whole of them, as many were very frivolous. The principal charges were: 1. For mutinous and disrespectful conduct to Captain Hawkins on such a date, having in a conversation with an inferior officer on the quarter-deck stated that Captain Hawkins was a spy and had spies in the ship. 2. For neglect of duty in disobeying the orders of Captain Hawkins on the night of the -of. 3. For having, on the -of, sent away 2 boats from the ship in direct opposition to the orders of Captain Hawkins. 4. For having again, on the morning of the -of, held mutinous and disrespectful conversation relative to Captain Hawkins with the gunner of the ship, allowing the latter to accuse Captain Hawkins of cowardice without reporting the same. 5. For insulting expressions on the quarter-deck to Captain Hawkins on his rejoining the brig on the morning of -of. 6. For not causing the orders of Captain Hawkins to be put in force on several occasions, etc., etc., etc. And further, as Captain Hawkins' testimony was necessary in 2 of the charges, the king on those charges was the prosecutor. 2 days before my court-martial, I received a letter from Ellen, who appeared in a state of distraction from this accumulation of misfortune. She told me that my father was to be buried the next day, and that the new rector had written to her to know when it would be convenient for the vicarage to be given up; that my father's bills had been sent in, and amounted to £1,200 already, and that she knew not the extent of the whole claims. There appeared to be nothing left but the furniture of the house, and she wanted to know whether the debts were to be paid with the money I had left in the funds for her use. I wrote immediately, requesting her to liquidate every claim, as far as my money went, sending her an order upon my agent to draw for the whole amount, and a power of attorney to him to sell out the stock. I had just sealed the letter when Mrs. Trotter, who had attended the ship since our return to Portsmouth, begged to speak with me, and walked in after her message without waiting for an answer. "My dear Mr. Simple," said she, "I know all that is going on, and I find that you have no lawyer to assist you. Now I know that it is necessary, and will very probably be of great service in your defence, for when people are in distress and anxiety, they have not their wits about them. So I have brought a friend of mine from Portsea, a very clever man, who, for my sake, will undertake your cause, and I hope you will not refuse him. You recollect giving me a dozen pair of stockings? I did not refuse them, nor shall you refuse me now." Mr. Trotter's advice was good, and although I would not listen to receiving his services gratuitously, I agreed to employ him, and very useful did he prove against such charges, and such a man as Captain Hawkins. He came on board that afternoon, carefully examined into all the documents, and the witnesses whom I could bring forward, showed me the weak side of my defense, and took the papers on shore with him. Every day he came on board to collect fresh evidence and examine into my case. At last the day arrived. I dressed myself in my best uniform. The gun fired from the admiral's ship, with the signal for a court-martial at 9 o'clock, and I went on board in a boat with all the witnesses. On my arrival, I was put under the custody of the provost marshal. The captains ordered to attend pulled alongside one after another, and were received by a party of marines presenting their arms. At 9:30, the court was all assembled, and I was ushered in. Court-martials are open courts, although no one is permitted to print the evidence. At the head of the long table was the admiral, as president. On his right hand standing was Captain Hawkins as prosecutor. On each side of the table were 6 captains sitting near to the admiral, according to their seniority. At the bottom, facing the admiral, was the judge advocate, on whose left hand I stood as prisoner. The court were all sworn, and then took their seats. Stanchions with ropes covered with green baize, passed along, were behind the chairs of the captains who composed the court, so that they might not be crowded upon by those who came in to listen to what passed. The charges were then read, as well as the letters to and from the admiral, by which the court-martial was demanded and granted, and then Captain Hawkins was desired to open his prosecution. He commenced with observing his great regret that he had been forced to a measure so repugnant to his feelings, his frequent cautions to me, and the indifference with which I treated them, and after a preamble composed of every falsity that could be devised, he commenced with the first charge, and stating himself to be the witness, gave his evidence. "I wish," said the second captain who was addressed, "to ask Captain Hawkins whether, when he came on deck, he came up in the usual way in which a captain of a man of war comes on his quarter deck, or whether he slipped up without noise." Captain Hawkins declared that he came up as he usually did. This was true enough, for he invariably came up by stealth. "But, Captain Hawkins, do you not think, allowing that you came up on deck in your usual way, as you term it, that you would have done better to have hemmed or hawed, so as to let your officers know that you were present? I should be very sorry to hear all that might be said of me in my supposed absence." To this observation Captain Hawkins replied that was so astonished at the conversation that he was quite breathless, having till then had the highest opinion of me. No more questions were asked, and they proceeded to the second charge. This was a very trifling one for lighting a stove contrary to orders. The evidence brought forward was the sergeant of marines. When his evidence in favour of the charge had been given, the following questions were put by some of the members of the court. "You have served in other ships before?" "Yes." "Did you ever, sailing with other captains, receive an order from them to report direct to them, and not through the first lieutenant?" The witness here prevaricated, answered directly yes or no. No. The third charge was then brought forward for sending away boats contrary to express orders. This was substantiated by Captain Hawkins' own evidence, the order having been verbal. By the advice of my counsel, I put no questions to Captain Hawkins, neither did the court. The fourth charge, that of holding mutinous conversation with the gunner, and allowing him to accuse the captain of unwillingness to engage the enemy, was then again substantiated by Captain Hawkins as the only witness. I again left my reply for my defence, and one only question was put by one of the members, which was to inquire of Captain Hawkins, as he appeared peculiarly unfortunate in overhearing conversations, whether he walked up as usual to the taffrail, or whether he crept up. Captain Hawkins gave the same answer as before. The fifth charge, for insulting expressions to Captain Hawkins, on my rejoining the brig at Karlskrona, was then brought forward, and the sergeant of marines, one of the seamen, appeared as witnesses. This charge excited a great deal of amusement. In the cross-examination by the members of the court, Captain Hawkins was asked what he meant by the expression, when disposing of the clothes of an officer who was killed in action, that the men appeared to think that his trousers would instill fear. "Nothing more, upon my honour, sir," replied Captain Hawkins, "than an implication that they were alarmed lest they should be haunted by his ghost." "Then, of course, Mr. Simple meant the same in his reply," observed the captain sarcastically. The remainder of the charges were then brought forward, but they were of little consequence. End of chapter 61. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 62 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by antonygirgis. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 62. A good defense not always good against a bad accusation. Peter wins the hearts of the judges, yet loses his cause and is dismissed his ship. The next day I commenced my defense. I preferred calling my own witnesses first, and, by the advice of my counsel and at the request of Swinburne, I called him. I put the following questions. When we were talking on the quarter-deck, was it fine weather? Yes, it was. Do you think that you might have heard anyone coming on deck in the usual way up the companion ladder? Sure of it. Do you mean, then, to imply that Captain Hawkins came up stealthily? I have an idea he pounced on us as a cat does a mouse. What were the expressions made use of? I said that a spy captain would always find spy followers. In that remark, were you and Mr. Simple referring to your own captain? The remark was mine. What Mr. Simple was thinking of I can't tell, but I did refer to the captain, and he has proved that I was right. This bold answer of Swinburne's rather astonished the court, who commenced cross-questioning him, but he kept to his original assertion that I had only answered generally. To repel the second charge, I produced 2 witnesses, but to the third charge I brought forward 3 witnesses to prove that Captain Hawkins's orders were that I should send no boats on shore, not that I should not send them on board of the men of war close to us. In answer to the fourth charge, I called Swinburne, who stated that if I did not, he would come forward. Swinburne acknowledged that I had accused the captain of being shy, and that I reprimanded him for so doing. Did he say that he would report you? Inquired one of the captains. No, sir, replied Swinburne, 'cause he never meant to do it. This was an unfortunate answer. To the fifth charge I brought several witnesses to prove the words of Captain Hawkins, and the sense in which they were taken up by the ship's company, and the men calling out "shame" when he used the expression. To refute the other charges, I called 1 or 2 witnesses, and the court then adjourned, inquiring of me when I should be ready to commence my defense. I requested a day to prepare, which was readily granted, and the ensuing day the court did not sit. I hardly need say that I was busily employed arranging my defense with the counsel. At last all was done, and I went to bed tired and unhappy, but I slept soundly, which could not be said of my counsel, for he went on shore at 11 o'clock, and sat up all night arranging and making a fair copy. After all, the fairest court of justice is a naval court-martial. No browbeating of witnesses, an evident inclination towards the prisoner, every allowance and every favour granted him, and no legal quibbles to attend to. It is a court of equity with very few exceptions, and the humbler the individual, the greater chance in his favour. I was awoke the following morning by my counsel, who had not gone to bed the previous night, and would come off at 7 o'clock to read over with me my defence. At 9 o'clock I again proceeded on board, and in a short time the court was sitting. I came in, handed my defence to the judge advocate, who read it aloud to the court. I have a copy still by me, and will give the whole of it to the reader. Mr. President and gentlemen, After nearly 14 years of service in His Majesty's naval duty, during which I have been twice made prisoner, twice wounded, and once wrecked, and, as I trust I shall prove to you by certificates in the public dispatches, I have done my duty with zeal and honour, I now find myself in a situation in which I never expected to be placed, that of being arraigned before and brought to a court-martial for charges of mutiny, disaffection, and disrespect towards my superior officer. If the honourable court will examine the certificates I am about to produce, they will find that until I sailed with Captain Hawkins, my conduct has always been supposed to have been diametrically opposite to that which is now imputed to me. I have always been diligent and obedient to command, and I have only to regret that the captains with whom I have had the honour to sail are not now present to corroborate by their oral evidence the truth of these documents. Allow me in the first place to point out to the court that the charges against me are spread over a large space of time, amounting to nearly 18 months, during the whole of which period Captain Hawkins never stated to me once that it was his intention to try me by a court-martial, and, although repeatedly in the presence of a senior officer, he never preferred any charge against me. The articles of war state expressly that if any officer, soldier, or marine has any complaint to make, he is to do so upon his arrival at any port or fleet where he may fall in with a superior officer. I admit that this article of war refers to complaints to be made by inferiors against superiors, but at the same time I venture to submit to the honourable court that a superior is equally bound to prefer a charge, or to give notice that the charge will be preferred, on the first seasonable opportunity, instead of lulling the offender into security and disarming him in his defence, by allowing the time to run on so long so as to render him incapable of bringing forward his witnesses. I take the liberty of calling this to your attention, and shall now proceed to answer the charges which have been brought against me. I am accused of having held a conversation with an inferior officer on the quarter-deck of His Majesty's brig Rattlesnake, in which my captain was treated with contempt, that it may not be supposed that Mr. Swinburne was an acquaintance made upon my joining of the brig. I must observe that he was an old shipmate with whom I served many years, and with whose worth I was well acquainted. He was my instructor in my more youthful days, and has been awarded for his merit with the warrant which he now holds as gunner of His Majesty's brig Rattlesnake. The offence observation in the first place was not mine, and in the second it was couched in general terms. Here Mr. Swinburne has pointedly confessed that he did refer to the captain, although the observation was in the plural, but that does not prove the charge against me. On the contrary, adds weight to the assertion of Mr. Swinburne that I was guiltless of the present charges. That Captain Hawkins had acted as a spy, his own evidence on this charge, as well as what was brought forward by other witnesses, will decidedly prove. But as the truth of the observation does not warrant its utterance, I am glad that no such expression escaped my lips. Upon the second charge I shall dwell but a short time. It is true that there is a general order that no stove shall be alight after a certain hour, but I will appeal to the honourable court whether a first lieutenant is not considered to have a degree of license of judgment in all that concerns the interior discipline of the ship. The surgeon sent to say that a stove was required for one of the sick. I was in bed at the time, and replied immediately in the affirmative. Does Captain Hawkins mean to assert to the honourable court they would have refused the request of the surgeon? Most certainly not. The only error I committed, if it was an error, was not going through the form of awakening Captain Hawkins to ask the permission, which, as first lieutenant, I thought myself authorized to give. The charge against me of having sent away 2 boats contrary to his order, I have already disproved by witnesses. The order of Captain Hawkins was not to communicate with the shore. My reasons for sending away the boats. Here Captain Hawkins interposed and stated to the President that my reasons were not necessary to be received. The court was cleared, and, on our return, the court had decided that my reasons ought to be given, and I continued. My reasons for sending away these boats, or rather, it was one boat which was dispatched to the 2 frigates, if I remember well, were that the brig was in a state of mutiny. The captain had tied up one of my men, and the ship's company refused to be flogged. Captain Hawkins then went ashore to the admiral to report the situation of his ship, and I conceived it my duty to make it known to the men of war anchored close to us. I shall not enter into further particulars, as they will only disdain the honourable court, and I am aware that this court-martial is held upon my conduct, and not upon that of Captain Hawkins. To the charge of again holding disrespectful language on the quarter-deck, as overheard by Captain Hawkins, I must refer the honourable court to the evidence, in which it is plainly proved that the remarks upon him were not mine, but those of Mr. Swinburne, and that I remonstrated with Mr. Swinburne for using such unguarded expressions. The only point of difficulty is, whether it was not my duty to have reported such language. I reply that there is no proof that I did not intend to report it, but the presence of Captain Hawkins, who heard what was said, rendered such report unnecessary. On the fifth charge, I must beg the court will be pleased to consider that some allowance ought to be made for a moment of irritation. My character was traduced by Captain Hawkins, supposing that I was dead, so much so, that even the ship's company cried out shame. I am aware that no language of a superior officer can warrant a retort from the inferior, but as what I was intended to imply by the language is not yet known, although Captain Hawkins has given an explanation to his, I shall merely say that I meant no more by my insinuations than Captain Hawkins did at the time by those which he made use of with respect to me. Upon the other trifling charges brought forward, I lay no stress, as I consider them fully refuted by the evidence which has already been adduced, and I shall merely observe that, for reasons best known to himself, I have been met with a most decided hostility on the part of Captain Hawkins, from the time that he first joined the ship, that on every occasion he used all his efforts to render me uncomfortable and embroil me with others, that, not content with narrowly watching my conduct on board, he has resorted to using his spyglass from the shore, and instead of assisting me in the execution of a duty sufficiently arduous, he has thrown every obstacle in my way, placed inferior officers as spies over my conduct, and made me feel so humiliated in the presence of the ship's company, over which I had superintended, and in the disciplining of which I had a right to look to him for support, that, were it not that some odium would necessarily be attached to the sentence, I should feel as if one of the happiest events of my life that I were dismissed from the situation which I now hold under his command. I now beg that the honourable court will allow the documents I lay upon the table to be read in support of my character. When this was over, the court was cleared that they might decide upon the sentence. I waited about half an hour in the greatest anxiety, when I was again summoned to attend. The usual forms of reading the papers were gone through, and then came the sentence, which was read by the president. He and the whole court standing up with their cocked hats on their heads. After the preamble, it concluded with saying that it was the opinion of the court that the charges had been partly proved, and therefore the Lieutenant Peter Simple was dismissed his ship. But, in consideration of his good character and services, his case was strongly recommended to the consideration of the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty. End of chapter 62. Chapter 63 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by antonygirgis. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 63. Peter looks upon his loss as something gained, goes on board the Rattlesnake to pack up, and is ordered to pack off. Polite leave-taking between relations. Mrs. Trotter better and better. Goes to London, and afterwards falls into all manner of misfortune by the hands of robbers and his own uncle. I hardly knew whether I felt glad or sorry at this sentence. On the one hand, it was almost a death blow to my future advancement or employment in the service. On the other, the recommendation very much softened down the sentence, and I was quite happy to be quit of Captain Hawkins and free to hasten to my poor sister. I bowed respectfully to the court, which immediately adjourned. Captain Hawkins followed the captains on the quarter-deck, but none of them would speak to him, so much to his disadvantage had come out during the trial. About 10 minutes afterwards, one of the elder captains composing the court called me into the cabin. "Mr. Simple," said he, "we are all very sorry for you. Our sentence could not be more lenient under the circumstances. It was that conversation with the gunner at the Tarfal which floored you. It must be a warning to you to be more careful in the future how you permit anyone to speak on the conduct of your superiors on the quarter-deck. I am desired by the President to let you know that it is our intention to express ourselves very strongly to the Admiral in your behalf, so much so, that if another captain applies for you, you will have no difficulty in being appointed to a ship. And as for leaving your present ship, under any other circumstances I should consider it a matter of congratulation." I returned my sincere thanks, and soon afterwards quitted the guardship, and went on board of the brig to pack up my clothes, and take leave of my messmates. On my arrival I found that Captain Hawkins had preceded me, and he was on deck when I came up on the side. I hastened down into the gun-room, where I received the condolements of my messmates. "Simple, I wish you joy," cried Thompson, loud enough for the captain to hear on deck. "I wish I had your luck. I wish somebody would try me by a court-martial." "As it has turned out," replied I in a loud voice, and after the communication made to me by the captains composing the court, of what they intended to say to the Admiralty, I agree with you, Thompson, that it is a very kind act on the part of Captain Hawkins. I feel quite grateful to him. "Steward, come, glasses," cried Thompson. "Let us drink success to Mr. Simple." All this was very annoying to Captain Hawkins, who overheard every word. When our glasses were filled, "Simple, your good health, and may I meet with as good a messmate," said Thompson. At this moment the sergeant of the marines put his head in the gunroom and said, in the most insolent tone, that I was to leave the ship immediately. I was so irritated that I threw my glass of grog in his face, and he ran up to the captain to make the complaint, but I did not belong to the ship, and even if I had, I would have resented such impertinence. Captain Hawkins was in a great rage, and I believe you would have written for another court-martial, but he had had enough of them. He inquired very particularly of the sergeant whether he had told me that I was to leave the ship directly, or whether the Captain Hawkins desired that I should leave the ship immediately, and finding he had not given the latter message, which I was aware of, for had he given it, I dared not have acted as I did, he then sent down again by one of the midshipmen, desiring me to leave the ship immediately. My reply was, that I should certainly obey his orders with the greatest pleasure. I hastened to pack my clothes, reported myself ready to the second lieutenant, who went up for permission to man the boat, which was refused by Captain Hawkins, who said I might go on shore in a shore boat. I called one alongside, shook hands with all my messmates, and when I arrived on the quarter deck with Swinburne, and some of the best men who came forward, Captain Hawkins stood by the binnacle bursting with rage. As I went over to the planeshear, I took my hat off to him, and wished him good morning very respectfully, adding, "If you have any commands from my uncle, Captain Hawkins, I shall be glad to execute them." This observation, which showed him that I knew the connection and correspondence between them, made him gasp with emotion. "Leave the ship, sir, or by God I'll put you in irons for mutiny," cried he. I again took off my hat, and went down the side and shoved off. As soon as I was a few yards distant, the men jumped on the carronade and cheered, and I perceived Captain Hawkins order them down, and before I was a cable length from her, the pipe, "All hands to punishment." So I presume some of the poor fellows suffered for their insubordination in showing their goodwill. I acknowledge that I might have left the ship in a more dignified manner, and that my conduct was not altogether correct, but still I state what I really did do, and some allowance must be made for my feelings. This is certain, that my conduct after the court-martial was more deserving of punishment than that which I had been tried, but I was in a state of feverish excitement, and I hardly knew what I did. When I arrived at Sally Port, I had my effects wheeled up on the blue posts, and packing up with those I most required, I threw off my uniform, which was once more a gentlemanly large. I took my place in the mail for that evening, sent a letter of thanks, with a few banknotes, to my counsel, and then sat down and wrote a long letter to O'Brien, acquainting him with the events which had taken place. I had just finished and sealed it up, when in came Mrs. Trotter. "Oh, my dear Mr. Simple, I am so sorry. I have come to console you. There's nothing like a woman where men are in affliction, as poor Mr. Trotter used to say, as he laid his head in my lap. When do you go to town?" "This evening, Mrs. Trotter." "I hope I am continued to attend the ship." "I hope so too, Mrs. Trotter. I have no doubt but you will." "Now, Mr. Simple, how are you off for money? Do you want a little? You can pay me by and by. Don't be afraid. I'm not quite so poor as I was when you came down to mess with Trotter and me, and when you gave me a dozen pair of stockings. I know what it is to want money, and what it is to want friends." "Many thanks to you, Mrs. Trotter," replied I, "but I have sufficient to take me home, and then I can obtain more." "Well, I'm glad of it, but it was offered in earnest. Goodbye, and God bless you. Come, Mr. Simple, give me a kiss. It won't be the first time." I kissed her, for I felt grateful for her kindness, and with a little smirking and oogling, she quitted the room. I could not help thinking, after she was gone, how little we knew the hearts of others. If I had been asked if Mrs. Trotter was a person to have done a generous action, from what I have seen of her in adversity, I should have decidedly said no. Yet in this offer she was disinterested, for she knew the service well enough to be aware that I had little chance of being a first lieutenant again, and of being of service to her. And how often does it also occur that those who ought, from gratitude or long friendship, to do all they can to assist you, turn from you in your necessity, and prove false and treacherous? It is God alone who knows our hearts. I sent my letter to O'Brien to the Admiral's office, sat down to a dinner which I could not taste, and at 7 o'clock got into the mail. I was very ill. I had a burning fever and a dreadful headache, but I thought only of my sister. When I arrived in town I was much worse, but did not wait more than an hour. I took my place in a coach which should not go to the town near which we resided, for I had inquired and found the coach was full, and I did not choose to wait another day. The coach in which I took my place went within 40 miles of the vicarage, and I intended to post across the country. The next evening I arrived at the point of separation, and taking out my portmanteau, ordered a chaise, and set off for what had once been my home. I could hardly hold my head up, I was so ill, and I lay in the corner of the chaise, in a sort of dream, kept from sleeping by intense pain in the forehead and temples. It was about 9 o'clock at night when we were in a dreadful jolting road. The shocks proceeded from which gave me agonizing pain, and the chaise was stopped by 2 men, who dragged me out onto the grass. One stood over me, while the other rifled the chaise. The postboy, who appeared a party to the transaction, remained quietly on the horse, and as soon as they had taken my effects, turned round and drove me off. They then rifled my person, taking away everything that I had, leaving me nothing but my trousers and shirt. After a short consultation, they ordered me to walk in on the direction in which they had been proceeding in the chase, and to hasten as fast as I could, or else they would blow my brains out. I complied with their request, thinking myself fortunate to have escaped so well. I knew that I was still 30 miles at least from the vicarage, but ill as I was, I hoped to be able to reach it on foot. I walked during the remainder of the night, but I got on but slowly. I reeled from one side of the road to the other, and occasionally sat down to rest. Morning dawned, and I perceived habitations not far from me. I staggered on in my course. The fever now raged in me, my head was splitting with agony, and I trotted to a bank near a small neat cottage on the side of the road. I have a faint recollection of someone coming to me and taking my hand, but nothing further, and it was not till many months afterwards that I became acquainted with the circumstances which I now relate. It appears that the owner of the cottage was a half-pay lieutenant in the army who had sold out on account of his wounds. I was humanely taken to his house, laid on a bed, and a surgeon requested to come to me immediately. I had now lost all recollection, and who I was they could not ascertain. My pockets were empty, and it was only by the mark of my linen that they found out that my name was Simple. For 3 weeks I remained in a state of alternate stupor and delirium. When the latter came on, I raved of Lord Privilege, O'Brien, and Celeste. Mr. Selwyn, the officer who was so kindly assisted me, knew that Simple was a patronymic name of Lord Privilege, and he immediately wrote to his lordship, stating that a young man of the name of Simple, who, in his delirium, called upon him and Captain O'Brien, was lying in a most dangerous state in his house, and that, as he presumed I was a relative of his lordship, he had deemed it right to apprise him of the fact. My uncle, who knew that it must be me, thought this too favourable an opportunity, provided I should live, not to have me in his power. He wrote to say that he would be there in a day or 2, at the same time thanking Mr. Selwyn for his attention to his poor nephew, and requesting that no expense might be spared. But when my uncle arrived, which he did in his own chariot, the crisis of the fever was over, but I was still in a state of stupor arising from extreme debility. He thanked Mr. Selwyn for his attention, which he said he was afraid was of little avail, as I was every year becoming more deranged, and he expressed his fears that it would terminate in chronic lunacy. His poor father died in the same state, continued my uncle, passing his hand across my eyes as if much affected. I have brought my physician with me to see if he can be moved. I shall not be satisfied unless I am with him night and day. The physician, who was my uncle's valet, took me by the hand, felt my pulse, examined my eyes, and pronounced that it would be very easy to move me, and that I should recover sooner in a more airy room. Of course Mr. Selwyn raised no objection, putting down all to my uncle's regard for me, and my clothes were put on me as I lay in a state of insensibility, and I was lifted into the chariot, as it is more wonderful that I did not die from being taken out of bed in such a state, but it pleased heaven that it should be otherwise. Had such an event taken place, it would probably have pleased my uncle much better than my surviving. When I was in the carriage, supported by the pseudo-physician, my uncle again thanked Mr. Selwyn, begged that he would command his interest, wrote a handsome cheque for the surgeon who had attended me, and getting into the carriage, drove off with me in a state of insensibility. That is, I was not so sensible, but I think I felt I had been removed, and I heard the rattling of the wheels, but my mind was so uncollected that I was in a state of such weakness that I could not feel assured of it for a minute. For some days after, for I recollect nothing about the journey, I found myself in bed in a dark room, and my arms confined. I recalled my senses, and by degrees was able to recollect all that had occurred, until I lay down by the roadside. Where was I? The room was dark. I could distinguish nothing. That I had attempted to do myself some injury, I took for granted, or my own arms would have been secured. I had been in a fever and delirious, I suppose, and had now recovered. I had been in a reverie for more than an hour, wondering why I was left alone, when the door of the apartment opened. "Who's there?" inquired I. "Oh, you've come to yourself again," said a gruff voice. "Then I'll give you a little daylight." He took down the shutter which covered the whole of the window, and a flood of light poured in, which blinded me. I shut my eyes, and by degrees admitted the light until I could bear it. I looked at the apartment. The walls were bare and whitewashed. I was on a truckle bed. I looked at the window. It was closed up with iron bars. "Why, where am I?" inquired I of the man with alarm. "Where are you?" replied he. "Why, in Bedlam." End of chapter 63. Chapter 64 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by antonygirgis. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 64. As O'Brien said, it's a long lane that has no turning. I am rescued, and happiness pours in upon me as fast as misery before overwhelmed me. The shock was too great. I fell back on my pillow insensible. How long I lay I know not, but when I recovered, the keeper was gone, and I found a jug of water and some bread by the side of the bed. I drank the water, and the effect it had upon me was surprising. I felt that I could get up, and I rose. My arms had been unpinioned during my swoon. It was about noon that the medical people, attended by the keepers and others, came into my apartment. "Is he quite quiet?" "Oh Lord, yes, sir, as quiet as a lamb," replied the man who had before entered. I then spoke to the medical gentleman, begging him to tell me why and how I had been brought here. He answered mildly and soothingly, saying that I was there at the wish of my friends, and that every care would be taken of me, that he was aware that my paroxysms were only occasional, and that, during the time that I was quiet, I should have every indulgence that I could be granted, and that he hoped that I should be perfectly well and be permitted to leave the hospital. I replied by stating who I was, and how I had been taken ill. The doctor shook his head, advised me to lie down as much as possible, and then quitted me to visit the other patients. As I afterwards discovered, my uncle had had me confined upon the plea that I was a young man who was deranged with the idea that his name was Simple, and that he was the heir to the title and estates, that I was very troublesome at times, forcing my way into his house and insulting the servants, but in every other respect was harmless, that my paroxysms generally ended in a violent fever, and that it was more from the fear of my coming to some harm than from any ill will towards the poor young man that he wished me to remain in the hospital and be taken care of. The reader may at once perceive the art of this communication. I, having no idea why I was confined, would of course soon continue to style myself by my true name, and as long as I did this, so long would I be considered in a deranged state. The reader must not therefore be surprised when I tell him that I remained in Bedlam for 1 year and 8 months. The doctor called upon me for 2 or 3 days, and finding me quiet, ordered me to be allowed books, paper, and ink to amuse myself. But every attempt at explanation was certain to be the signal for him to leave my apartment. I found, therefore, not only by him, but from my keeper, who paid no attention to anything I said, that I had no chance of being listened to or of obtaining my release. After the first month, the doctor came to me no more. I was a quiet patient, and he received the report of the keeper. I was sent there with every necessary document to prove that I was mad, and although a very little may establish a case of lunacy, it requires something very strong indeed to prove that you are in your right senses. In Bedlam I found it impossible. At the same time, I was well treated, was allowed all necessary comforts, and such amusements as could be obtained from books, etc. I had no reason to complain of the keeper, except that he was too much employed to waste his time in listening to what he did not believe. I wrote several letters to my sister and to O'Brien during the first 2 or 3 months, and requested that the keeper put them in the post. This he promised to do, never refusing to take the letters, but, as I afterwards found out, they were invariably destroyed. Yet I still bore up with the hopes of release for some time, but the anxiety relative to my sister, when I thought of her situation, my thoughts of Celeste and O'Brien, sometimes quite overcame me. Then indeed I would almost become frantic, and the keeper would report that I had a paroxysm. After 6 months I became melancholy, and I wasted away. I no longer attempted to amuse myself, but sat all day with my eyes fixed upon vacancy. I no longer attended to my person. I allowed my beard to grow. My face was never washed unless mechanically when ordered by the keeper, and if I was not mad, there was every prospect of my soon becoming so. Life passed away as a blank. I had become indifferent to everything. I noted time no more. The change of seasons was unperceived. Even the day and the night followed without my regarding them. I was in this unfortunate situation when one day the door was opened, and as had been by the custom during my imprisonment, visitors were going round the establishment to indulge their curiosity in witnessing the degradation of their fellow creatures or to offer their commiseration. I paid no heed to them, not even casting up my eyes. "This young man," said the medical gentleman who accompanied the party, "has entertained the strange idea that his name is Simple, and that he is the rightful heir to the title and property of Lord Privilege." One of the visitors came up to me and looked me in the face. "And so he is," cried he to the doctor, who looked with astonishment. "Peter, don't you know me?" I started up. It was General O'Brien. I flew into his arms and burst into tears. "Sir," said General O'Brien, leading me to the chair and seating me upon it, "I tell you that it is Mr. Simple, the nephew of Lord Privilege, and, I believe, the heir to the title. If, therefore, his assertion of such being the case is the only proof of his insanity, then he is illegally confined. I am here, a foreigner, and a prisoner on parole, but I am not without friends, my Lord Belmore," said he, turning to another one of the visitors who had accompanied him. "I pledge you my honour that I state is true, and I request you immediately demand the release of this poor young man." "I assure you, sir, that I have Lord Privilege's letter," observed the doctor. "Lord Privilege is a scoundrel," replied General O'Brien, "but there is justice to be obtained in this country, and he shall pay dearly for his lettre de cachet. My dear Peter, how fortunate was my visit to this horrid place! I have heard so much of the excellent arrangements of this establishment that I agreed to walk around with Lord Belmore, but I find that it is abused." "Indeed, General O'Brien, I have been treated with kindness," replied I, "and particularly by this gentleman. It was not his fault." General O'Brien and Lord Belmore then inquired of the doctor if he had any objection to my release. "None whatever, my lord, even if he was insane, although I see now that I have been imposed upon. We allow the friends of any patient to remove him, if they think that they can pay him more attention. He may leave with you this moment." I now did feel my brain turn with the revulsion from despair to hope, and I fell back to my seat. The doctor, perceiving my condition, bled me copiously, and laid me on the bed, where I remained more than an hour, watched by General O'Brien. I then got up, calm and thankful. I was shaved by the barber of the establishment, washed and dressed myself, and leaning on the general's arm, was led out. I cast my eyes upon two celebrated stone figures of melancholy and raging madness as I passed them. I trembled and clung more tightly to the general's arm, was assisted into the carriage, and bade farewell to madness and misery. The general said nothing until we approached the hotel where he resided in Dover Street, and then he inquired in a low voice whether I could bear more excitement. "Is it Celeste you mean, General?" "It is, my dear boy. She is here," and he squeezed my hand. "Alas!" cried I, "what hopes have I now of Celeste?" "More than you had before," replied the general. "She lives but for you, and if you are a beggar, I have a competence to make you sufficiently comfortable." I returned the general's pressure of the hand, but could not speak. We descended, and in a minute I was led by the father into the arms of the astonished and delighted daughter. I must pass over a few days, during which I almost recovered my health and spirits, and had narrated my adventures to General O'Brien and Celeste. My first object was to discover my sister. What had become of poor Ellen, in the destitute condition in which she had been left, I knew not, and I resolved to go down to the vicarage and make inquiries. I did not, however, set off until a legal adviser had been sent for by General O'Brien, and due notice given to Lord Privilege of an action to be immediately brought against him for false imprisonment. I set off in the mail, and the next evening arrived in the town of . I hastened to the parsonage, and the tears stood in my eyes as I thought of my mother, my poor father, and the peculiar and doubtful situation of my dear sister. I was answered by a boy in livery, and found the present incumbent at home. He received me politely, listened to my story, and then replied that my sister had set off for London on the day of his arrival, and that she had not communicated her intentions to anyone. He then was all clue lost, and I was in despair. I walked to the town in time to throw myself into the mail, and the next evening joined Celeste and the general, to whom I communicated the unpleasant intelligence, and requested advice how to proceed. Lord Belmore called the next morning, and the general consulted him. His lordship took great interest in my concerns, and previous to any further steps, advised me to step into his carriage, and allow him to relate my case to the First Lord of the Admiralty. This was done immediately, and as I had now the opportunity of speaking freely to his lordship, I explained to him the conduct of Captain Hawkins and his connection with my uncle, also the reason of my uncle's persecution. His lordship, finding me under such powerful protection as Lord Belmore, and having eye to my future claims, which my uncle's conduct gave him reason to suppose were well founded, was extremely gracious, and said that I should hear from him in a day or two. He kept his word, and on the third day after my interview I received a note announcing my promotion to the rank of commander. I was delighted with this good fortune, as was General O'Brien and Celeste. When at the Admiralty, I inquired about O'Brien, and found that he was expected home every day. He had gained great reputation in the East Indies, was chief in command at the taking of some of the islands, and, it was said, was to be created a baronet for his services. Everything wore a fashionable respect, except the disappearance of my sister. This was a weight on my mind I could not remove. But I have forgotten to inform the reader by what means General O'Brien and Celeste arrived so opportunely in England. Martinique had been captured by our forces about 6 months before, and the whole of the garrison surrendered as prisoners of war. General O'Brien was sent home and allowed to be on parole. Although born a Frenchman, he had very high connections in Ireland, of whom Lord Belmore was one. When they arrived, they had made every inquiry for me without success. They knew that I had been tried by a court-martial and dismissed my ship, but after that, no clue could be found for my discovery. Celeste, who was fearful that some dreadful accident had occurred to me, had suffered very much in health, and General O'Brien, perceiving how much his daughter's happiness depended upon her attachment for me, had made up his mind that if I were found, we should be united. I hardly need to say how delighted he was when he discovered me, though in a situation so little to be envied. The story of my incarceration, of the action to be brought against my uncle, and the reports of foul play relative to the succession had, in the meantime, been widely circulated among the nobility, and I found that every attention was paid me, and I was repeatedly invited out as an object of curiosity and speculation. The loss of my sister also was a subject of much interest, and many people from goodwill made every inquiry to discover her. I had returned one day from the solicitors, who had advised for her in the newspapers without success, when I found a letter for me on the table in an Admiralty enclosure. I opened it. The enclosure was one from O'Brien, who had just cast anchor at Spithead, and who had requested that the letter should be forwarded to me if anyone could tell my address. My dear Peter, where are and what has become of you? I have received no letters for these 2 years, and I have fretted myself to death. I received your letter about the rascally court-martial, but perhaps you have not heard if the little scoundrel is dead. Yes, Peter, he brought your letter out in his own ship, and that was his death warrant. I met him at a private party. He brought up your name. I allowed him to abuse you, and then I told him that he was a liar and a scoundrel, upon which he challenged me, very much against his will, but the affront was so public that he could not help himself. Upon which I shot him with all the good will in the world, and could he have jumped up again 20 times like Jack in the Box, I would have shot him every time. The dirty scoundrel! But there's the end of him. Nobody pitied him, for everyone hated him, and the Admiral only looked grave, and then was very much obliged to me for giving him a vacancy for his nephew. By the by, from some unknown hand, but I presume from the officers of his ship, I received a packet of correspondence between him and your worthy uncle, which is about as elegant a piece rascality as ever was carried on between two scoundrels. But that's not all, Peter. I have a young woman for you who will make your heart glad. Not Mademoiselle Celeste, for I don't know where she is, but the wet nurse who went out to India. Her husband was sent home as an invalid, and she was allowed her passage home with him in my frigate. Finding that she belonged to the regiment, I talked to her about one O'Sullivan who married in Ireland, and mentioned the girl's name, and when he discovered that she was a countryman of mine, he told me that his real name was O'Sullivan, sure enough, but that he had always served as O'Connell, and that his wife on board was the young woman in question, upon which I sent to speak to her, and telling her that I knew all about it, and mentioning the names of Ella Flanagan and her mother, who had been given me the information, she was quite astonished. And when I asked her what had become of the child which she took in place of her own, she told me that it had been drowned at Plymouth, and that her husband was saved at the time by a young officer, whose name I have here, says she, and then she pulled out of her neck your card, with Peter Simple on it. Now, says I, do you know, good woman, that in helping on the rascally exchange the children, you ruin that very young man who saved your husband, for you deprive him of his title and property? She stared like a struck pig when I said so, and then cursed and blamed herself, and declared she'd write you as soon as we came home, and most anxious she is still to do so, for she loves the very name of you. So you see, Peter, a good action has its reward sometimes in this world, and a bad action also, seeing as how I've shot that confounded villain who dared to ill-use you. I have plenty more to say to you, Peter, but I don't like writing what perhaps may never be read. So I'll wait till I hear from you, and then, as soon as I get through my business, we will set to and trounce that scoundrel of an uncle. I have 20,000 pounds jammed together in the Consolidated, besides the Spice Islands, which will be a pretty penny, and every farthing of it shall go to right you, Peter, and make a lord of you, as I promised you often that you should be, and if you win you shall pay, and if you don't, then damn the luck, and damn the money too. I beg you will offer my best regards to Miss Ellen, and say how happy I shall be to hear that she is well. But it has always been on my mind, Peter, that your father did not leave too much behind him, and I wish to know how you both got on. I left you a carte blanche at my agent's, and I only hope that you have taken advantage of it if required. If not, you're not the Peter that I left behind me. So now, farewell, and don't forget to answer my letter in no time. Ever yours, Terence O'Brien. This was indeed joyful intelligence. I handed the letter to General O'Brien, who read it, Celeste hanging over his shoulder and perusing it at the same time. "This is well," said the general. "Peter, I wish you joy, and Celeste, I ought to wish you joy also at your future prospects. It will indeed be gratification if ever I hail you as Lady Privilege." "Celeste," said I, "you did not reject me when I was penniless and in disgrace. Oh, my poor sister Ellen, if I could find but you, how happy should I be!" I sat down to write to O'Brien, acquainting him with what had occurred, and the loss of my dear sister. The day after the receipt of my letter, O'Brien burst into the room after moments of the congratulation were past. He said, "My heart's broken, Peter, about your sister Ellen. Find her I must. I shall give up my ship, for I'll never give up the search as long as I live. I must find her." "Do pray, my dear O'Brien, and I only wish—" "Wish what, Peter? Shall I tell you what I wish? That if I find her, you'll give her to me for my trouble." We then turned around to General O'Brien and Celeste. "Captain O'Brien," said the general. "Sir Terence O'Brien, if you please, General. His Majesty has given me a handle to my name." "I congratulate you, Sir Terence," said the general, shaking him by the hand. "What I was about to say is, that I hope you will take your quarters in this hotel, and we will all live together. I trust that we will soon find Ellen. In the meantime, we have no time to lose in our exposure of Lord Privilege. Is the woman in town?" "Yes, and under lock and key, but the devil fear of her. Millions would not bribe her to wrong him who risked his life for her husband. She's Irish, General, to the backbone. Nevertheless, Peter, we must go to our solicitor to give the intelligence that he may take the necessary steps." For 3 weeks, O'Brien was diligent in his search for Ellen, employing every description of emissary without success. In the meantime, the general and I were prosecuting our cause against Lord Privilege. One morning, Lord Belmore called us, and asked the general if he would accompany him to the theatre to see 2 celebrated pieces performed. In the latter, which was a musical farce, a new performer was to come out of whom report spoke highly. Celeste consented, and after an early dinner we joined his lordship in his private box, which was above the stage on the first tier. The first piece was played, and Celeste, who had never seen the performance of Young, was delighted. The curtain then drew up for the second piece. In the second act, the new performer, Miss Henderson, was led by the manager on the stage. She was apparently much frightened and excited, but 3 rounds of applause gave her courage, and she proceeded. At the very first notes of her voice I was startled, and O'Brien, who was behind, threw himself forward to look at her. But as we were almost directly above, and her head was turned the other way, we could not distinguish her features. As she proceeded in her song, she gained courage, and her face was turned towards us, and she cast her eyes up, saw me. The recognition was mutual. I held out my arm, but could not speak. She staggered, and fell down in a swoon. "'Tis Ellen!" cried O'Brien, rushing past me, and making one spring down on the stage, he carried her off before any other person could come to her assistance. I followed him, and found him with Ellen still in his arms, and the actress assisting in her recovery. The manager came forward to apologize, stating that the young lady was too ill to proceed, and the audience, who had witnessed the behaviour of O'Brien and myself, were satisfied with the romance in real life which had been exhibited. Her part was read by another, but the piece was little attended to, every one trying to find out the occasion of this uncommon occurrence. In the meantime, Ellen was put into a hackney coach by O'Brien and me, and we drove to the hotel, where we were soon joined by the General and Celeste. End of chapter 64. Chapter 65 of Peter Simple. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by antonygirgis. Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT. Chapter 65. It never rains, but it pours. Whether it be good or bad news, I succeed in everything, and to everything my wife, my title, and my estate, and all's well that ends well. I shall pass over the scenes which followed, and give my sister's history in her own words. I wrote to you, my dear Peter, to tell you that I had considered it my duty to pay all my father's debts with your money, and that there were but £60 left when every claim had been satisfied, and I requested you to come to me as soon as you could, that I might have your counsel and assistance as to my future arrangements. I received your letter, Ellen, and was hastening to you when, but no matter, and I will tell you my story afterwards. Day after day I waited with anxiety for a letter, and then wrote to the officers of the ship to know if any accident had occurred. I received an answer from the surgeon, informing me that you had quitted Portsmouth to join me, and had not since been heard of. You may imagine my distress at this communication, as I did not doubt but that something dreadful had occurred, as I know, too well, that nothing would have detained you from me at such a time. The new vicar appointed had come down to look over the house, and to make arrangements for bringing in his family. The furniture he had previously agreed to take at a valuation, and the sum had been appropriated in liquidation of our father's debts. I had already been permitted to remain longer than was usual, and had no alternative but to quit, which I did not do until the last moment. I could not leave my address, for I knew not where I was to go. I took my place in the coach, and arrived in London. My first object was to secure the means of livelihood by offering myself as a governess, but I found great difficulties from not being able to procure a good reference, and from not having already served in that capacity. At last I was taken into a family to bring up 3 little girls, but I soon found out how little chance I had of comfort. The lady had objected to me as too good-looking. For this same reason the gentleman insisted upon my being engaged. Thus I was a source of disunion. The lady treated me with great harshness, and the gentleman with too much attention. At last her ill treatment and his persecution were both so intolerable that I gave notice that I should leave my situation. I beg your pardon, Miss Ellen, but will you oblige me with the name and residence of that gentleman? Said O'Brien. Indeed, Ellen, do no such thing, replied I. Continue your story. At last I was engaged as a teacher to a school. I had better have taken a situation as a housemaid. I was expected to be everywhere, to do everything, was up at daylight, and never in bed till past midnight, fared very badly, and was equally ill paid. But still it was honest employment, and I remained there for more than a year. But though as economical as possible, my salary would not maintain me in clothes and washing, which was all I required. There was a master of elocution who came every week, and whose wife was the teacher of music. They took a great liking to me, and pointed out how much better I should be off if I could succeed on the stage, of which they had no doubt. For months I refused, hoping still to have some tidings of you, but at last my drudgery became so insupportable, and my means so decreased, that I unwillingly consented. It was then 19 months since I had heard of you, and I mourned you as dead. I had no relations except my uncle, and I was unknown even to him. I quitted the situation, and took up my abode with the teacher of elocution and his wife, who treated me with every kindness, and prepared me for my new career. Neither at school, which was 3 miles from London, nor at my new residence, which was over Westminster Bridge, did I ever see a newspaper. It was no wonder, therefore, that I did not know of your advertisements. After 3 months' preparation, I was recommended and introduced to the manager by my kind friends, and accepted. You know the rest. Well, Miss Ellen, if anyone ever tells you that you were on the stage, at all events you may reply that you wasn't there long. My sister had been with us about 3 days, during which I had informed her of all that had taken place, when, one evening, finding myself alone with her, I candidly stated to her what were O'Brien's feelings towards her, and pleaded his cause with all the earnestness in my power. My dear brother, replied she, I have always admired Captain O'Brien's character, and always have felt grateful to him for his kindness and attachment to you. But I cannot say that I love him. I have never thought about him, except as one whom we are both much indebted. But do you mean to say that you could not love him? No, I do not, and I will do all I can, Peter. I will try. I never will, if possible, make him unhappy who has been so kind to you. Depend upon it, Ellen, that with your knowledge of O'Brien, and with feelings of gratitude towards him, you will soon love him, if once you accept him as a suitor. May I tell him? You may tell him that he may plead his own cause, my dear brother, and, at all events, I will listen to no other, until he has had fair play. But recollect that at present I only like him very much, it is true, but still, I only like him. I was quite satisfied with my success, and so was O'Brien when I told him. By the powers, Peter, she's an angel, and I can't expect her to love an inferior being like myself. But if she'll only like me well enough to marry me, I'll trust to after marriage for the rest." O'Brien, having thus obtained permission, certainly lost no time in taking advantage of it. Celeste and I were more fondly attached every day. The solicitor declared my case so good that he could raise £50,000 upon it. In short, all our causes were prosperous, when an event occurred, the details of which, of course, I did not obtain until some time afterwards, but which I shall narrate here. My uncle was very much alarmed when he discovered that I had been released from Bedlam, still more so when he had notice given him of a suit relative to the succession to the title. His emissaries had discovered that the wet nurse had been brought home in O'Brien's frigate, and was kept so close that they could not communicate with her. He now felt that all his schemes would prove abortive. His legal adviser was with him when they had been walking in the garden, talking over the contingencies, when they stopped close to the drawing-room windows of the mansion at Eagle Park. "But, sir," observed the lawyer, "if you will not confide in me, I cannot act for your benefit. You still assert that nothing of the kind has taken place?" "I do," replied his lordship. "It is a foul invention." Then, my lord, may I ask why you considered it advisable to imprison Mr. Simple in Bedlam?" "Because I hate him," retorted the lordship. "Detest him." "And for what reason, my lord? His character is unimpeached, and he is your near relative." "I tell you, sir, that I hate him. Would that he were now lying dead at my feet." Hardly were the words out of my uncle's mouth, when a whizzing was heard for a second, and then something fell down within a foot of where they stood with a heavy crash. They started, turned round, the adopted heir lay lifeless at their feet, and their legs were besplattered with blood in his brains. The poor boy, seeing his lordship below, had leaned out of one of the upper windows to call to him, but lost his balance, and had fallen head foremost upon the wide stone pavement which surrounded the mansion. For a few seconds the lawyer and my uncle looked upon each other with horror. "A judgment! A judgment!" cried the lawyer at last, looking at his client. My uncle covered his face with his hands and fell. Assistance now came out, but there was more than one to help up. The violence of his emotion had brought on an apoplectic fit, and my uncle, although he breathed, never spoke again. It was in consequence of this tragic event, of which we did not know the particulars until afterwards, that the next morning my solicitor called and put a letter into my hands, saying, "Allow me to congratulate your lordship." We were all at breakfast at the time, and the General, O'Brien, and myself jumped up, all in astonishment at this unexpected title being so soon conferred upon me, that we had a heavy bill for damages to pay, and had not Ellen caught the tea-urn, as it has tipped over, there would, in all probability, have been a doctor's bill into the bargain. The letter was eagerly read. It was from my uncle's legal adviser, who had witnessed the catastrophe, informing me that all dispute as to the succession was at an end by the tragical event that had taken place, and that he had put seals upon everything, awaiting my arrival or instructions. The solicitor, as he presented the letter, said that he would take his leave and call again in an hour or two, when I was more composed. My first movement, when I had read the letter aloud, was to throw my arms round Celeste and embrace her, and O'Brien, taking the hint, did the same to Ellen, and was excused in consideration of circumstances. But as soon as she could disengage herself, her arms were intertwined round my neck, while Celeste was hanging on her father's. Having disposed of the ladies, the gentlemen now shook hands, and although we had not all appetites to finish our breakfast, never was there a happier quintet. In about an hour my solicitor returned and congratulated me, and immediately set about the necessary preparations. I desired him to go down immediately to Eagle Park, attend to the funeral of my uncle and the poor little boy who had paid so dearly for his intended advancement, and take charge from my uncle's legal adviser, who remained in the house. The dreadful accidents in high life found its way into the papers of the day, and before dinner time a pile of visiting cards was poured in, which covered the table. The next day a letter arrived from the First Lord, announcing that he had made out my commission as post captain, and trusted that I would allow the pleasure of presenting it himself at the dinner hour at 7:30. Very much obliged to him, the fool of the family might have waited a long while for it. While I was reading this letter, the waiter came up to say that a young woman below wanted to speak to me. I desired her to be shown up. As soon as she came in, she burst into tears, knelt down, and kissed my hand. "Sure, it's you! Oh,
Yes, it's you that saved my poor husband when I was assisting to your ruin. And an't I punished for my wicked doings? An't my poor boy dead?"
She said no more, but remained on her knees, sobbing bitterly. Of course the reader recognizes in her that the wet nurse who had exchanged her child. I raised up, and desired her to apply to my solicitor to pay her expenses and leave her address.
"But do you forgive me, Mr. Simple? It's not that I have forgiven myself."
"I do forgive you with all my heart, my good woman. You have been punished enough."
"I have indeed,"
replied she, sobbing.
"but don't I deserve it all? And more too. God's blessing and all the saints too upon your head, and your kind forgiveness anyhow. My heart is lighter."
And she quitted the room. She scarcely quitted the hotel when the waiter came up again. "Another lady, my lord, wishes to speak to you, but she won't give her name." "Really, my lord, you seem to have an extensive female acquaintance," said the general. "At all events, I am not aware of any that I need to be ashamed of. Show the lady up, waiter." In a moment entered a fat, unwieldy little mortal, very warm from walking. She sat down in a chair, threw back her tippet, and then exclaimed, "Lord bless you, how you've grown, Gemini! If I can hardly believe my eyes, and I declare he don't know me." "I really cannot exactly recollect where I had the pleasure of seeing you before, madam." "Well, that's what I said to Jemima when I went down into the kitchen. 'Jemima,' says I wonder if little Peter Simple will know me?' And Jemima says, 'I think he would the parrot, marm.'" "Miss Handycock, I believe," said I, recollecting Jemima and the parrot, although from a thin little woman she had grown so fat as to not be recognizable. "Oh, so you found me out, Mr. Simple. My lord, I ought to say. Well, I need not ask after your grandfather now, for I know he's dead. But as I was coming this way for orders, I thought I would just step in and see how you looked." "I trust Mr. Handycock is well, ma'am. Pray, is he a bull or a bear?" "Lord bless you, Mr. Simple, my lord, I should say, he's been neither bull nor bear for these 3 years. He was obliged to waddle. If I didn't know much about bulls and bears, I know very well what a lame duck is to my cost. We're off to the stock exchange, and Mr. Handycock is set up as a coal merchant." "Indeed." "Yes, that is, we have no coals, but we take orders, and have half a crown a chaldron for our trouble. As Mr. Handycock says, it's a very good business, if you only had enough for it. Perhaps your lordship may be able to give us an order. It's nothing out of your pocket, and something into ours." "I shall be very happy when I return again to town, Mrs. Handycock. I hope that the parrot is quite well." "Oh, my lord, that's a sore subject. Only think of Mr. Handycock, when we retired from the change, taking my parrot one day and selling it for 5 guineas, saying 5 guineas was better than a nasty squalling bird. To be sure, there was nothing for dinner that day, but as Jemima agreed with me, we'd rather have gone without a dinner for a month than have parted with Paul. Since we've looked up a little in the world, I saved up 5 guineas by hook or by crook, and tried to get Paul back again, but the lady said she wouldn't take 50 guineas for him." Mrs. Handycock then jumped from her chair, saying, "Good morning, my lord. I'll leave one of Mr. Handycock's cards. Jemima would be so glad to see you." As she left the room, Celeste laughingly asked me whether I had any more such acquaintances. I replied that I believed not, but I must acknowledge that Mrs. Trotter was brought to my recollection, and I was under some alarm lest she should come and pay her respects. The next day I had another unexpected visit. We had just sat down for dinner, when I heard a disturbance below, and shortly after, the general's French servant came up in great haste, saying there was a foreigner below who wished to see me, and that he had been caning one of the waiters of the hotel for not paying him proper respect. "Who can that be?" thought I, and I went out of the door, and looked over the banisters as the noise still continued. "You must not come here to be Englishmen, I can tell you," roared one of the waiters. "Who do we care for your foreign courts?" "Sacre canaille!" cried the other party in a contemptuous tone, which I well knew. "Ay, canal! We'll duck you in the canal, if you don't mind." "You will," said the stranger, who had hitherto spoken French. "Allow me to observe, in the most delicate manner in the world, just to hint that you're a damned treacherous, scraping, napkin-carrying, shilling-seeking, up and down the stairs, son of a bitch, and take this for your impudence." The noise of the cane was again heard, and I hastened downstairs, where I found Count Shuskin thrashing 2 or 3 of the waiters without mercy. At my appearance, the waiters, who were showing fight, retreated to a short distance, out of reach of the cane.
"My dear Count," exclaimed I, "is it you?" and I shook him by the hand. "My dear Lord Privilege, will you excuse me, but these fellows are saucy." "Then I'll have them discharged," replied I. "If a friend of mine, and an officer of your rank and distinction, cannot come to see me without insult, I will seek another hotel." This threat of mine, and the reception I gave the Count, put all to rights. The waiter sneaked off, and the master of the hotel apologized. It appeared that they had desired him to wait in the coffee room until they could announce him, which had hurt the Count's dignity. "We are sitting down to dinner, Count. Will you join us?" "As soon as I have improved my toilette, my dear lord," replied he. "You must perceive that I am off a journey." The master of the hotel bowed, and proceeded to show the Count to a dressing room. When I returned upstairs, "What was the matter?" inquired O'Brien. "Oh, nothing. A little disturbance in consequence of a foreigner not understanding English." In about 5 minutes the waiter opened the door, and announced Count Shuckson. "Now, O'Brien, you'll be puzzled," said I, and in came the Count. "My dear Lord Privilege," said he, coming up and taking me by the hand, "let me not be the last to congratulate you on your accession. I was running up the channel in my frigate, when a pilot boat gave me the newspaper, in which I saw your unexpected change of circumstances. I made an excuse for dropping my anchor at Spithead this morning, and I have come up post to express how sincerely I participate in your good fortune." Count Shuckson then politely saluted the ladies and the general, and turned round to O'Brien, who had been staring at him with astonishment. "Count Shuckson, allow me to introduce Sir Terence O'Brien." "By the piper that played before Moses, but it's a puzzle," said O'Brien, earnestly looking in the Count's face. "Blood and thunder, if it ain't Chucks! My dear fellow, when did you rise from your grave?" "Fortunately," replied the Count, as they shook each other's hand for some time, "I never went into it, Mr. Therese, but now with your permission, my lord, I'll take some food, as I really am not a little hungry. After dinner, Captain O'Brien, you shall hear my history." His secret was confided to the whole party, upon my pledging myself for their keeping it locked up in their own breasts, which was a bold thing on my part, considering that 2 of them were ladies. The Count stayed with us for some time, and was introduced by me everywhere. It was impossible to discover that he had not been bred up in a court. His manners were so good, he was a great favourite with the ladies, and his mustachios, bad French, and waltzing, an accomplishment he had picked up in Sweden, were quite the vogue. All the ladies were sorry when the Swedish Count announced his departure by a PPC. Before I left town, I called upon the First Lord of the Admiralty, and procured for Swinburne a first-rate building, that is to say, ordered to be built. This he had often said he wished, as he was tired of the sea after a service of 45 years. Subsequently, I obtained leave of absence for him every year, and he used to make himself very happy at Eagle Park. Most of his time was, however, passed on the lake, either fishing or rowing about, telling long stories to all who would join him in his water excursions. A fortnight after my assuming my title, we set off for Eagle Park, and Celeste consented to my entreaties that the wedding should take place that day month. Upon this hint, O'Brien spoke, and to oblige me, Ellen consented that we should be united on the same day. O'Brien wrote to Father McGrath, but the letter was returned by post with "dead" marked upon the outside. O'Brien then wrote to one of his sisters, who informed him that Father McGrath would cross the bog one evening, when he had taken a very large proportion of whiskey, and that he was seen out of the right path, and had never been heard of afterwards. On the day appointed we were all united, and both unions have been attended with as much happiness as the world can afford. Both O'Brien and I are blessed with children, which, as O'Brien observed, have come upon us like old age, until we now can muster a large Christmas party in the 2 families. The general's head is white, and he sits and smiles, happy in his daughter's happiness, and in the gambols of his grandchildren. Such, reader, is the history of Peter Simple, Viscount Privilege, no longer the fool, but the head of the family, who now bids you farewell. End of chapter 65, and the end of Peter Simple by Frederick MARRYAT.